going to record. All right. So here we go. I'm going to minimize all of you so I can see what I am doing. So please, just as last week, please feel free to speak up if you have a question or anything to share. All right, so structural. So really what I'm going to be doing here is highlighting pieces of our reading and also going over some of the kind of foundational components of the approach. All right, just kidding. Okay, so very similar to what we talked about last week, just in terms of, families and this systemic approach. So really what Minuchin did was he set up his essentially theory of families and how families function and why they have the types of dynamics and functionality that they do. Again, like we talked about last week, a child is generally a pretty good barometer for families. So if the child is behaving in a certain way, it is usually in response to something that is happening within the dynamics of the family. And they are a real sponge in terms of the stresses that are affecting the family. So an example of this, like we talked about last week, of that kind of parental subsystem, to use structural terms, if there is conflict there, what they may do, so this is in Bowen what would be considered triangulating, but in structural it's considered detouring, is in order to limit or decrease the conflict, they're going to put their attention onto the child, and the child likely will become more symptomatic in response to the essentially inappropriate attention or the displacing of the stress onto the child. So some just statements that Minuchin stands by is an individual's psychic life is not entirely an internal process. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. I'll cover this in some future slides when we talk a little bit more about that socioecological model and how humans don't exist in vacuums, but this is something we already know. Changes in the family structure also contribute to changes in behavior and that inner psychic process of the members. So it's kind of this recursive type of process where the individual is affected by the system in turn also affects the individual. And then with structural therapists, generally structural therapists are very active. So they are, we're learning about the concept of joining, and that has a very specific meaning in structural. So when the therapist works with the client or the family, their behavior also becomes part of the context. So you can't separate yourself as the therapist and believe that your behaviors or your choices or whatever happens within the room is completely independent of the family. So you have to be really aware of the fact that you are joining the system in a way, but you also have to be aware of not being detoured or not being triangulated, because that's also a term that is used in structural within the family, so as to perpetuate any of the maladaptive or harmful dynamics. So the foundation of therapy is the therapist joins the family with the goal of changing the organization. So the nature of structural is understanding the organization, and then likely, so with the structural family therapist, the theory or the hypothesis is that the structure or the organization is really to blame for any sort of symptomology or harmful or unhealthy dynamics, whatever kind of valued terms you want to put on that. So it's the organization that is the culprit in terms of creating dysfunction within the family. And so we want to reorganize in such a way that the family members' experiences change. So again, this kind of bi-directional process of the family's experiences inform the organization also informs the family's experience. But our focus is the organization.
And just to be clear, when we're talking about the system, we're
Yep,
really talking about the rules and roles? Or is
exactly.
there another piece as well?
Rules, roles, boundaries, subsystems. We'll get into all of those components, but the system is the people. And what organizes the people are the rules, roles, subsystems, and boundaries. And the hierarchy, according to a
How would
therapist.
subsystems, boundary, and hierarchy differ from rules and roles? Are they not just specific examples of those larger principles?
So rules exist within subsystems and outside of subsystems. So do roles. So the rules dictate who is in and out of each subsystem, who is where in a hierarchy. So I would say that the rules and roles like penetrate each piece of that. They exist within each of those concepts. Does that answer your question, George?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. So structural family therapy, very action oriented, very present oriented. I always forget about what we talk about every week. We've only had one class too, so get ready for like week 12 when I have no idea what's going on. All right, so structural family therapists, very focused in the present. So very little interest in talking about the past. If you've ever watched Harry Aponte do therapy, he's much more integrative with this approach. He has a much more like soul-focused approach than Salvador Minuchin does, where he does integrate some history, but a purist, a structural family therapy purist conceptualizes the fact that history brought us to where we are today. So if we focus on the present, we'll have almost like this retroactive or retrospective corrective experience. So I don't need to understand family dynamics. I don't need to understand any sort of transgenerational transmission process or anything like that. I just need to work on what is not working right now and reorganizing this family. And that will kind of take care of any sort of historical stuff that's happened. Okay, so now what I want to do is stop talking for a second. So that kind of covered the first chapter. So the second chapter of the Minuchin book, Salvador did a interview with a quote normal couple. So I want us to reflect on that. So this slide, or actually I'm looking at it as if you guys can see it. So that our PowerPoint right now will go away. So if you can access it in Canvas, because even if I were to post these questions into the chat, once you go into breakout rooms, they disappear anyway. So if you can just open up the PowerPoint in Canvas, so you can, when you're in your breakout groups, actually see the questions that I'm wanting you to answer. What I'm going to do is I'll put you in groups of like 3 or 4, and I want you to go question by question. So is everybody able to access the PowerPoint? Or at least, I mean, obviously just one person in the group needs it. Okay, so I'm going to put you all in breakout rooms, and I'll leave you in there for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes to answer these questions. So I'm just creating them now. All right, I'll see you in about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm not sure how to allow that. So is that a setting that you are aware of?
Yeah, because it said it didn't allow based on the facilitator.
Yeah, when you click share screen, you can just I think you click
Oh,
only host can share, or everyone can share.
That is very much a setting that I just changed it to. Okay, cool. All right, so when we come back into the large group after these breakout rooms, you're always welcome to share. I encourage it. I know that you just spent time in rooms doing that. But in terms of like thoughts on the interview, so this is a, quote, normal couple, and we'll get into some concepts about that as well. What did your group talk about in terms of your thoughts on the interview with this couple? And then we'll get more detailed into that as we go through these questions.
I think our group was talking about like the implicit rules and roles that they had without even realizing that that they were rules. You know, we were well, I brought up like you know, we do what I want to do on Saturday, and then he gets to choose whatever he wants to do on Sunday. And it was just interesting how something that seems so, yeah, like I could see that they would be like, oh, that's just kind of how we do it, unimportant, really is so implicit, and it is a rule, and these are rules that we're playing in. To bring that to light is very helpful. And yeah.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you highlighting that, Sarah, because one of our roles, in my opinion, is to make anything implicit like that explicit, making these dynamics known to everyone, because like you said, it's so ingrained that we completely take it for granted, and it also absolutely influences how we function. Any other thoughts on the interview that you all talked about in your groups?
I think going off what Sarah was saying, one thing I noticed but didn't necessarily appreciate was how categorical the subsystems were. Because it's like, okay, well, if you're acting like this, you are not fulfilling your spouse subsystem. And it almost leaves no room for nuance or growth in that sense. It's almost like a barometer of like, you're at 5 in the spouse and you're at 2 in the parental. And it's just, it goes back to what you were saying last week on critiquing the evidence-based model, because that kind of, even though it's systemic, it made me almost, think like that.
The other thing we noticed, because I was in Justine's group, was that, Mnuchin was pretty snarky. So we now call him Snarky Sal.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Normal, he was like saying, yeah, what is that?
Exactly.
I think I want to add to that too. I know, I don't know, there's a comment that he had made in the interview where he kind of really outspokenly said, that means they didn't grow up, meaning her parents didn't grow up, and they continued treating her as the daughter when she wanted to be somebody different, when she wanted to be the wife. I think it was kind of, I don't know, I'm like imagining if that were me receiving that kind of statement, like, would that work for me? Would that work for a person of a different race?
Sure.
So yeah, the snarkiness might be there, or the confidence to be there to be able to do that. And I'm curious about, like, just being careful to be mindful of like the different cultures, like, because I might take that really offensive.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it could, but the thing about it is that maybe knowing where he comes from, I think I would say, okay, well, this is what that value or that's supposed to be for where that culture is. And, oh, okay, maybe then I need to recognize and move it more towards, so this as a structural therapist, I'm seeing they're organizing and showing priority for the couple subsystem. I mean, that there is, in my sense, and I think about an implicit role of the structural therapist, that there must be this departure from, parental subsystem to couple subsystem.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jocelyn. I think you're also touching on the concept within structural family therapy of creating a common enemy. So that's potentially could be something that plays in here, where if I'm seeing a divide in a subsystem, I may say something pretty provocative to get them to join essentially against me in saying, no, wait a minute, that's an inappropriate hypothesis or perception of my family. And you can kind of see, so there is almost like a paradoxical piece to this. As we mentioned last week of some of these more modern approaches, there's almost an inherent paradoxical piece. So to your point of maybe having that be very, well, I would argue that a lot of the stuff that Mnuchin and Aponte did, it was very intuitive, so very true to them. It was also probably purposeful, like, so that provocativeness was really built in of, if you're going to work with me, I'm not going to hold back any punches. I'm going to say exactly what I think. I'm going to share these hypotheses really early. And if you disagree with me, I feel like largely the air was, if you disagree with me, you won't forever. You'll come to see that I am accurate, which I don't think is as prominent in some of these postmodern approaches.
And it's also very much an MD approach, isn't it?
Yes.
I'm the expert. Listen to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can see where people have this medical or psychiatric background, where that's just where they're trained. You are the expert, and it's a very different spirit than the expert that we're taught to be. Laura, did you raise your hand?
Oh, I was just following to what Jocelyn was saying. It is hard to find individuation when it's the daughter. She wanted to be treated now as a wife, but she's stepping into the system of the mother. Remember, they moved with the mother to be able to kind of get, save or whatever, to start their own home. So I think that culturally, I'm thinking maybe I'm coming from the perspective of how would I feel if somebody moves into my system wanting to execute the power of the mother when they're in my system. So I think that may also make it hard for her to be treated now as I am the wife of my own home when they were both under the same roof. That's
absolutely. Yeah, it's like two simultaneous existences, right? With people that are seeing this person in very different ways, and the person that it's mainly affecting is was Emily, right? Was it Emily and Mark? Yeah, great point, Laura. Thank you. So what about any elements of circular causality? So really just bringing in this systemic lens. We'll go with circular causality and cybernetics. What did you talk about in your groups for that? So just some of those more general systems concepts.
So we were in my group comparing how the emotion focused therapy kind of takes the past and brings it in, and how structural doesn't, but in a way that's what circular causality kind of does. It's, understanding those interactions, and somewhere they do overlap in a way.
What overlaps?
The circular causality. In my understanding, it was that, the term itself, it just brings the interactions basically back, even though structural doesn't really focus on the past or brings the past into the room. It kind of, the circular causality kind of does that, and it brings not just, one understanding of an interaction. It's not a linear continuum. It's way more kind of like you have to bring previous interactions, even though structural doesn't focus in the past, we do have to bring those in, like previous interactions of how the couple previously understood their own interactions.
Okay, so where did you see that happening in the interview?
Well, kind of like in like asking, for instance, how the couple would interact before, or what was, something that like how would they solve something, how would they solve a problem before. That's kind of like what I saw it as a circular causation, but maybe not.
Yeah, so the concept of circular causality is just that. So linear is A causes B. This happened, therefore this happened. Circular causality is expanding our understanding of that, where something happened, then there was a reaction, then there was a reaction to a reaction. So there's a lot of like kind of data points that influence that, which you could argue absolutely that history is a data point. But yeah, so just making sure that we're on the same page on that. Daniel, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add to what Juliana was saying, because talking about this in our group, I was actually the one that brought it up about how structural is, you don't deal with the past, or you don't think much or focus much on the past. And that personally, that messes with me, because I love attachment, I love EFT. So it's like staying structural, staying within this framework. Initially it goes against like my clinical instincts, if that makes sense at all.
Absolutely.
But structural is also powerful in its own self, because you want to understand just the circular motion of how when A event happens, B happens, C happens, and then this person happens to this. So it's still powerful in its own right, but really not going with the past, which you do kind of essentially. You want to know the history and things of that. It's just fascinating and unique that it's no strong consideration for the past. Let's just figure out what's happening now and see what we can do to work on and change this essentially for the better of the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would disagree though. I think they bring the past into the present. Like when you talk about circular causality, I think it's more of a sense of how has the same patterns been circling over time that still exists today, because in the interview they do go back into the past, but they bring it to today. So for example, like just the dynamic of the husband not being able to commit emotionally because he's a student, that in effect triggers the wife to shut down, and that circular causality of that continuously happening is from the past, but is brought into the present because of that dynamic not being able to be broken at the time.
Right, exactly. So a structural therapist wouldn't say, tell me a little bit about your history as a student, tell me a little bit about your attachment to your parents, what was modeled to you. They would say all of these things that have been mentioned inform where we're at right now. So let's do a corrective experience here because the past can get, for lack of a better term, you can get into a lot of stuff. It can take some time, and structural is meant to be brief. So there's, not necessarily concessions or anything that needs to be made, but if a family is coming to you and saying, we need help now, we have, 6 sessions, or we have a limited amount of time, this would be something that would work. And the theory is that everything that's happened, just as Justine was saying, in the past informs the present. So if we work in the present, we're by proxy working on the past.
So that would be like, so in the interview, when Mnuchin is bringing up, asking about where they were living, when they first got married and they were living with her parents, and then sort of from that came about the conversation about her not feeling supported, and that he did choose sides. Like, even though we're not talking about the past is coming in because it's going to tie into the present.
Exactly. So even talking about like the concept of sequencing, right, and enactments, those are informed by the past, but you're playing them out right now and how they're affecting your everyday today. So it's not that the past is irrelevant. That's absolutely not what structural therapists are saying. They're saying, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because what's happened has happened. And if I'm going to be action oriented, I have to stay in the present to do that. Feel free to share contextual information, because that sequencing, that timeline is important, because what the person is essentially saying is, there was this time where I like this period. So if this was when I moved in with my parents, there was this period of time where we functioned differently. And then this happened and now we function differently here. That's important to understand the difference in those dynamics. But at the end of the day, we're going to focus here because what's done is done. Maybe not as like brash as that, but Laura, did you had something?
No, I was thinking exactly about what you were saying, how I don't know even how he got there, but we got to find out a little bit of the family of origin that he came from, the father being kind of the outsider and kind of mother taking care of the needs of the family and everything. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, now you are into the next generation, he's focusing in his studies, kind of maybe thinking that his wife is going to automatically assume the kind of role that he maybe saw in that system that he comes from. But I don't even know how Minuchin got to there. He's so skilled with like the way he does his things, because we got information. Oh, so this was his system that he comes from. And now he's creating his own family. And what were his role models?
Mhm.
And it's almost like during the article, he kind of expects his wife to step into this sort of role, but she comes from completely different family.
Yeah, and you saw how even in an interview, right? So this isn't therapeutic. It's not meant to be therapeutic. That what Minuchin was doing was sharing hypotheses, really, and that's a lot of what structural family therapists really do, is they share early hypotheses. So it sounds like, this was the family schema. I know I'm using like CBT stuff, but this was essentially because schemas are also used in structural. But this was the thought process, or this was the dynamic there, and you've carried it here. So this is worth acknowledging. We're not going to sit and process this. We're not going to understand the generational stuff here. We're going to mention it because it's important and it informs where we're at today. We're going to like give a nod to it, but we're going to understand how to function differently, how to organize differently where we're at today. So I don't want you guys.
He's also.
Go ahead, George.
Sorry. No, the latency here. I'm sorry. I'm always stepping on other people's lines. No, I was just going to say he's concerned about the development of the new family and the process that we go through when we set up our own family. Also, I think it was interesting that this was a couple that they were high school sweethearts. So the husband was well known to both the parents, and they were well known to him. And so I think it was easier for him to just sort of slide in there. Frankly, I'm surprised the parents let them sleep together, but there it is. It was the wild 70s, I guess, when they were doing this. Or maybe this was even earlier. Maybe this is 60s, I forget. So some attitudes were different.
So I'm not sure.
74, so it might be late 60s. At least they weren't those dirty hippies, eh? But there weren't as many choices available for Emily as there would be today.
Sure.
She was, right on the mommy track, and that was cool. And that's, so there were a lot more stereotypical cultural expectations in the air. We have a lot more choices today, how we're going to do and who we're going to do it with. So that's not expressed, but it's in there. But Minuchin is concerned about what are the processes that people have to do to go through in order to make these changes and leave parents and set up as our own family unit and still have connection with what came before, but here and now with our own kid, little Tommy.
So structural absolutely gives a nod to family life cycle and individual life cycle. Ultimately, a structural therapist is looking at a family and saying, I'm getting a snapshot of where you're at in your family life cycle. So very informed by the developmental approach. And what you've been doing is no longer working. So we're going to reorganize with the knowledge that you're going through some sort of transition. So it's essentially like a difficulty in adjusting to a new life experience. And that's really how structural therapists conceptualize what's going on with the families that they are serving.
That's right. It's a never-ending adjustment disorder.
Right? We need longer than 6 months with it, right? To be able to bill for it. Okay, so one more question that I want to ask the group, and then we'll go ahead and take that break. Our first hour is up. So just wanting to open up for anybody who, like, any major takeaways that you learned or anything that stood out, any new insights that you wanted to share with the larger group or that you talked about in your groups.
I just really want to say shout out to Miss Laura for holding it down for us, because we had trouble accessing the books because we're waiting for the books to come. But she did such a great job of summarizing the takeaways and all the information for us. And also we were able to really clarify the definitions of like circular causality and cybernetics. So I think that that was like really fruitful for us. It was really great, and we're able to really hash that out. So for us, that was definitely a takeaway.
Oh, well, thank you. Good, Moni, I'm glad. And yeah, shout out to you, Laura.
But they did a great job explaining the other part that I didn't understand. So we worked together really good. Thank you, Monica and Brianna. And I think Miles was with us.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that when I was reading the readings, I really am surprised that I survived my marriage, because, you know, I've been married for 20 years. I know I was reading about family, you know, the individuation, forming new alliances, becoming now. And I come from a Mexican traditional, you live with your parents joined by the hip, like literally. And my husband is European, he's Dutch, completely different. And when I was reading, he never understood how enmeshed I was with mom. And so I'm reading and I'm like, yeah, I was forming a new loyalty to my spouse. No wonder they couldn't really understand it. And, you know, so I was reading through all of this and I was thinking, you know, when you find yourself beginning a new system, especially if you are multicultural unions, I mean, that's the only one I have. It really is a complex process.
Absolutely.
And, you know, there's a lot of invisible, right? Invisible things that we cannot understand, and they cause stress and sadness. But this is all this invisible stuff that when you make sense of it, not only from a clinical perspective, but a personal perspective, it really humbles me, you know, to the job we do.
Great. Yeah, I sometimes I feel like we might know too much for our own good. You know, just the more that we learn about systems and families, the more that we get a chance to kind of ruminate over it and honestly pathologize things that probably have no business being pathologized. But I want to, we'll go on a break right now, but I really want to keep me accountable in terms of some of the critiques of structural, specifically Laura, when you were talking about enmeshment and how that's a concept that really needs to make sure that it's really relevant, culturally relevant, because I think it's a very easy dynamic to pathologize when it's very culturally normative, because you can kind of see some of that like Eurocentric thinking, some of that individuated thinking. So for what it's worth, I'll punctuate what you just said there, and then we'll go ahead and okay. So I'm going to talk to you for a while. So again, can't see you, so please feel free to jump in. So this is, what was it, chapter 4 also that we had to read? Anyway, we're still in the Minuchin text with this.
It was chapter 6.
Thank you, chapter 6. This is where we are now. So just again, I'm very open to feedback on this. What I'm taking on as the role is to reiterate pieces of the readings to make sure that, you synthesize the content and it makes sense to you so that it can inform the groups that are also presenting on that model, and then filling in any sort of blanks. So hopefully this doesn't feel too redundant. And if it does, just please give me that feedback. All right, so again, conceptualizing the family. So understanding that families are influenced by any sort of changes that are happening in society. So just thinking of like, technology advances, how the family really has to adjust as society around them is adjusting, but it's really not a bi-directional process. It is more of a I don't necessarily want to say top down, but it's more of like a macro in type process. And so the concept of individuation absolutely is borrowed from Bowen here, of the human experience having a balanced sense. And again, this isn't always culturally relevant. And we'll talk about that when we get into Bowen. and some of the critiques there is this sense of belonging. So this sense of connection and togetherness, and then this sense of being separate. So with the concept of individuation that is used in structural as well as Bowen, is that there's this balance of I can maintain my own identity, my beliefs, my morals, while also maintaining connection to a system that simultaneously gives me identity. And I can feel connected without feeling pressure of believing the same as the group for the sake of believing the same as the group, because if I don't, then I won't have community or belongingness there. So it's this balance. So like it says here, every member's sense of identity is influenced both by their sense of belonging to a specific family, as well as their roles within that family. So, to George's point, if you think of a structure and the organization, there's a hierarchy, right? And theoretically with structural, at the top of that hierarchy is that executive system or that parental subsystem and then kind of inside of that is the couple subsystem. Then there should be a clear boundary, then the sibling subsystem. So again, looking at a very traditional way of structuring a family as well. Again, one of the critiques and one of the adaptations that needs to be made with structural, but your membership, not only within that subsystem, but within that family gives you identity, and the rules of that allow you to understand who is in and who is out of that family. So in some larger family systems, which structural doesn't necessarily give a nod to, of like the concept of extended family, is sometimes there's a really big divide between the nuclear family or that family of origin and any of the extended family members. And in some families, that's absolutely not a boundary. But the idea is within this family, that larger extended family, that helps to give the individual a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. So beyond the family, the sense of separateness and individuation can occur with extra familial relationships as well. So these peer relationships, particularly with adolescents, that gain that sense of identity from, their peer group and whatever, kind of characteristics there are with that. So I'll take myself, for example, like my participation in an extra familial group outside of my family, which is what extra familial means, was in sports. So a lot of my identity was founded in my participation in sports and my identity as an athlete. So that would just be an example of that. Okay, so
Sarah, I'm sorry, I have a quick question.
For sure.
As we're going through this, is from here and the reading is where we're going to get the information for the outline?
What do you mean by that, Sarah?
Yeah, so the outline that we're doing for each theory, the theory outline.
Yeah.
Worksheet. So we should be taking notes and inputting the information from here. And that's just an outline, right? I don't need to put that into a written style, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So yes, this is the information. So I'm basically just like summarizing the stuff that we read about. So you can feel free to make that outline as you're reading as well.
Okay.
All right. So the matrix of identity. So again, the concept of, societal influences. So change moves from society to the family, but never the other way. So here you can see, even with these lines of the exosystem and macrosystem kind of being influenced by one another, the family doesn't go beyond really the mesosystem. So there is no macro system. So you can see that the arrows don't reach one another, but there's an inherent known fact that the system affects the microsystem. The macro system affects the microsystem. So just again, understanding families in context. That's one of the things that separates us as couple and family therapists, as systemic thinkers from other mental health professionals, is that we really give a lot of credence to that macro system. So the family is an open system in transformation, of course, depending upon some boundaries. So it's constantly receiving inputs from these outside forces, and then it's basically forced to adapt, or it really digs its heels in and doesn't adapt. So within structural, if those boundaries are too open, then there's too much influence, and then there's a kind of a lack of identity. And if these boundaries are too rigid, if they're too closed, then there is a lack of adaptation, which is inherently going to be difficult, because that's the nature of our life, is like adapting through this family life cycle and through these individual life cycles. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the exosystem a little bit here, because so just as a review, the exosystem is, these are influences that indirectly affect the individual or the family. So media, for example, and I think that, you know, this is really relevant to us, because I do think that there still is a leaning toward this. Like and we're evolving, because I think representation in media of just like different kinds of families being a lot more overt about struggles that families experience. But I'm just thinking of, like, you know, the Brady Bunch or Family Matters or something like that, where these were just ultimately families that just like bounced back and were generally just like having an okay time. So just keeping in mind, when you're families come to see you, that this type of influence, the influence of the media, is very much internalized. So, you know, even when you think of, from our reading, you know, your concept of a normal family, what informs that? And I know a lot in our field, we say, you know, normal is relative and all that kind of stuff, or normal doesn't exist, or whatever it is, but we still, I think, have internalized, whether we like it or not, some image of a family, and you either fall in line with that image or you deviate from that image. So I think it's important to acknowledge that these are messages that have strongly influenced us as a society and ultimately as individuals. So, you know, we see these images in media of these kind of harmonious families, or these families that, you know, we don't really, if they are in struggle or they are in conflict, we don't really see the process. So we just, especially in media, you know, you got to tie up these episodes with a nice bow and finish them. It's either suspenseful, but it always, you know, you always end up figuring out what happened, but you don't know the process. So I wanted to highlight this, because you very well may have couples or families that come into your space and say, oh my gosh, we went through this like pretty common thing, but because it's not seen, or they don't have any exposure to it, they think it's really abnormal, or it's like really aberrant. So that it's very possible that families are coming to you really pathologizing something that's pretty common. And unfortunately, I mean, for what it's worth, even as helpers and people who are learning a lot about systems and how diverse systems are, that we're not immune to the internalization of some of the influence of the media. So in terms of schema, and so the family is a system, and it's operating within social context, and there are three components to a schema. The structure of the family is that of an open sociocultural system in transformation. So it is evolving with with cultural influences, with advances. And again, so as George stated, you know, we're in a constant state of transition, but I think you said adjustment disorder, right? But that's essentially what we're in, is this consistent state of transition, and it's really about navigating these different transitions. So the family undergoes development, moving through several stages that require restructuring. So when we think of stressors, you know, we have those horizontal stressors and the vertical stressors. We're looking more at the horizontal stressors here of, you know, things that happen throughout the life cycle, like, you know, for example, a birth of a child, a marriage, a divorce, a death, And all of these additions and kind of subtractions from a family or changes within a family need to be adjusted to, and we need to restructure from that. Because if you're like an addition of a family member, for example, that changes the implicit and explicit rules and roles of the family, which influence the subsystems, the structure, the hierarchy, the boundaries. So the family adapts to these changed circumstances in order to maintain continuity and enhance the psychosocial growth of each member. So ultimately, a family is set up to try to teach an individual how to function in the world and how to thrive in a world. That's kind of the general function of a family, is to give an individual the tools that they need in order to essentially procreate and keep our species going. But like we talked about last week, the tilt that families lean into is that of homeostasis. So they're really it's a system that's meant to resist change, and that there needs to sometimes be something provocative that can elicit the change. So that's what informs some of Minuchin's approaches or techniques within this. But everything that, as the family is adapting, the goal is to maintain the general structure, because we don't want to change too much, because then we don't understand the roles, we don't understand the rules, our hierarchy is confusing. Now I don't know who I am, I don't know where I'm supposed to be, I don't know what my membership is. So there's a protection of the existing organization that sometimes doesn't fit anymore based on what the family is experiencing. So in terms of schema, you can take this, old schema that was functioning for whatever reason, prior to the birth of a child, or prior to a marriage, or prior to an adoption, or something like that. They're taking this old schema and trying to place it on to the current time, and it's just not working. And so there's this feeling of stuckness. There's this feeling of this difficulty in adjusting, or this resistance to adjust, which is really like I said, these systems are set up to resist change. That's just kind of how humans function. So within this structure, like we've talked about, there's this invisible set of demands that organizes how we interact. So the main concepts, the main things that we are looking at within structural family therapy are rules, roles, subsystems, boundaries, and hierarchy. And then families are also conceptualized as working and being organized through transactional patterns. So all of these, the rules, roles, subsystems, boundaries, and hierarchy, like what that looks like day to day is the transactional patterns that maintain the system and maintain the structure. So just, so we're taking potentially some of these more abstract concepts and like, okay, so what would that look like in therapy? What would we do with that? Is we would want to change the transactions and how people interact with one another, who interacts with who, how people interact. So just so you can maybe get something more concrete of like what this would look like in the room, that's what you would be focusing on. And ultimately these transactional patterns inform the rules, roles, subsystems, boundaries, and hierarchy. There's two types of systems. There's the generic system, where this is just something that is kind of thought to be inherent in all families. So these universal roles that govern family organization, it's like, this is something that you could look at and see in all families. And this was the foundation of structural, because the thought is every family, I don't care how it's composed, it is composed, it has a structure. So that's kind of where structural family therapy was born, with the idea that regardless of what it looks like, what the parameters around a family, that's the structure. So that is a universal truth of families, is that they all have an they all have organization. But then there's also the idiosyncratic system of constraint, which is unique to the family that's sitting in front of you. So, again, a little bit of a nod to the past here, but not necessarily something that you delve into a lot, is that the origins of some of these more implicit and explicit negotiations have happened for centuries, for, for generations and generations. So again, it's important to acknowledge the fact that the history informs the present, but we're not going to talk about great-great-grandpa and all of the things that happened to him, because we're looking at the legacy of great-great-grandpa and how great-great-grandpa manifests today. And that's where we're going to focus our work. So there are alternative patterns that are always available in a system. The structural family therapist is basically thinking their alternatives exist. The family's just not really aware of them, or they may be concerned about them and not really utilizing them. So these patterns can be accessible, but if the change of these patterns is so big, it's kind of like a slingshot or a rubber band, I guess, is that if you stretch it too far, so if this is like kind of the comfort zone, if you stretch the family too far away from it, they're just going to snap back to where they are. So these changes have to be incremental, but sometimes in order to have a catalyst or to start a change, you may need something kind of paradoxical, which is a tool that Minuchin was not afraid to use. So again, just highlighting the fact that the system is set up to resist change and resist you. So I say that to all of you because I don't want you to get discouraged, or I don't want you to feel like it's something personal. That's just really how systems work. Is they like homeostasis, they like to know what's predictable, and even when they come to you, they still don't necessarily want you switching things up too much, or they want you switching things up in the way that they think they should be switched up. And as the expert, or as an outsider that has less emotional investment into the family, you may see other options or other ways that the family is not able to see. So we're going to move into the concept of subsystems here. So within the family, they differentiate and understand their own roles in the confines of subsystems. So subsystems can be by generation. They can sometimes be by sex or gender. They can be by interest. So like if you have a couple of siblings that are really into sports, and then some siblings that are into the arts, they may just kind of separate themselves that way, which again, it's just helping navigate and like kind of be a lab for outside social interactions. And that was one of the things that Minuchin said, is the family is kind of the laboratory in which siblings and children learn how to navigate the world and interact with others in the world. So everyone belongs to different subsystems simultaneously. So for example, if you have a sibling subsystem, you may also have subsystems within that where they are based on gender, or you may have. And so within those subsystems, people may have differing levels of power. So even, for example, within the executive subsystem, so that parental subsystem, so if it is a two-parent subsystem, for example, they may have differing power dynamics within the executive or parental subsystem than they do within the couple subsystem. So it is very important to acknowledge the existence of both. So parents are inherently part of both the parental subsystem as well as the couple subsystem, and they are fundamentally different, and they function differently, and they should be attended to differently. And then also the concept of complementarity. So I don't remember if we talked about this last week, but it's the concept that like someone else's weaknesses or something that they're not necessarily, very good at is kind of balanced out by some strengths in another individual and vice versa. But this can also be something where there's like an under-functioning partner and an over-functioning partner. So that's the concept of complementarity, where it can be both functional and dysfunctional. Like complementarity doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good positive thing, but it is meant to try to balance. And sometimes the way that we balance in the long term doesn't work out because it's like it's a short-term fix that is not sustainable long-term. All right, so the concept of boundaries. So boundaries are around both subsystems as well as the larger family unit. So these are the roles that define who participates in which unit or in which subsystem and how they do that. These boundaries are created, or these rules are created within the subsystems, but also with the influence of other subsystems. So the sibling subsystem, for example, influences the parental subsystem and vice versa, but they should be distinct. So that's where these clear boundaries come in, to make sure that people understand what their role is and where they fit within this system. I don't know if I have does anybody have a question? Okay. With the parent sub, can you guys see my chat too? Are you guys able to see anything?
No,
Oh, okay.
we can see the screen.
Oh, that's good. I can still see stuff in private. Okay, so I have a question. With the parent subsystem example where you mentioned parental subsystem versus couple subsystem, are the parents still part of the child subsystem to their parents, or have they exited that role once starting their own family unit? That's a great question. And this is also a shortcoming of structural family therapy in that that Minuchin didn't necessarily incorporate extended family into these concepts, but I would argue, yes, they're still part of the child subsystem in their family of origin, but in terms of the concepts of like differentiation and family life cycle, that their role as a child in their family of origin should be much less prominent than their current role as parents. So that it's like this honoring of the family life cycle and the adjustment that's happening in life. So it's does that answer your question, Sarish?
Yes, I think I also had a follow-up question in terms
of
so with the subsystems, I hear this theme of pairing, so like siblings, and then there's parents, and then there's a couple. So what happens when there's an only child? What kind of subsystem does that person fall into, or is there one?
Yeah, so this is you're leading us into a good segue once we get into the feminist critique of this approach. Is some of the language around this is very assumptive, right? That there will be two parents, that there will be multiple siblings. So one of the critiques of this is to actually use the terminology that exists within the family. So like, for example, if it's a single parent that is like a mother, that you wouldn't say the parent subsystem, you would say like the mother subsystem, because the sibling subsystem could also be the child subsystem, or the person's name subsystem, because ultimately it's really about the structure and the willingness of the family to have whoever is in that executive subsystem to influence the rest of the system without really having this bi-directional power influence, that it really should be a top-down influence where children should be able to be children. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. Thank you for clarifying that for me.
All right, I have another one. I can't see where my cursor is. Okay, so George, you want to share this?
Oh, how do I do that? I just
say what you just typed.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm not sure that separating parental from a couple subsystem is useful or even a real thing, because parenting would be one of the things we do as a couple.
Right, but
created these children.
Yep.
It seems like it's an artificial and just maybe just too precious. This is Sal getting caught up in his own stuff. How is it helpful? That's what I don't get.
Well, so I think what can, all right, Laura and Justine, do you guys want to share before I hop in here? I don't know if you're responding to George's comment.
I think from what Minuchin is referring to, and I agree in terms of like when I'm reading it, I see that they're separated, but at the same time, I also feel that the language being used is a bit categorical and specific, but I understand the meaning behind it, especially in the example of the husband and wife, because in terms of like a spouse subsystem, I think it's more so the ability to have been able to work through the problems or dynamics that did not flood into the parental subsystem, if that makes sense. So like it could have helped them when they had Tommy if they had worked on the different roles of, say, Mr. Wagner is, I don't even know if that's his, yes, okay.
Yeah.
Having emotionally committed to the relationship before the child. So instead of having it happen almost naturally when he was faced with having to be a father, it's almost being able to recognize what his spouse needed at the time. I don't know if that's, I could be wrong.
And again, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but I don't see how that is any maybe I'm trying to be difficult, but what the hell? Maybe I don't really see how that is significantly different from any other set of responsibilities that we take on in our couplehood.
Yeah, Laura and Tiffany, you guys both raised your hands. Feel free to jump in here, please.
Well, going back to the case that we read, I think that what was interesting that the parental subsystem, once the kids go to college, and I think in somewhere it was like, then the other subsystem as a couple needs to have some solidarity in order, right, for the relationship to continue, because we see it often when, and I see in my own practice that when the kids go to college, I see a lot of people coming in for questions of divorce because maybe that's a subsystem as a couple did not have the same energy that they put as a parental, right? Like the kids and their college and their academics and all the things, and they work really good together as a parental subsystem. But maybe, and I don't know if the word is neglect, maybe at the expense that once the kids left, then the couple system took precedent. And then it's like, okay, what do we really have in common now as a couple subsystem? So I think that that's the perspective that I think it, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know
Laura.
that people really live that way though. You know, we're talking about the same people, you know, in a unit, and they have different concerns and different interactions, but they're still the same subsystem.
Okay. Well, I want to give Tiffany and I want to give Tiffany and Caitlin a chance to hop in here too, because I want to speak to what you're talking about, George, because I think it's important. I also think they are distinct and there are different ways to work with them. So Tiffany and Caitlin, feel free to jump in here, please.
And in a perfect world, I absolutely agree with Laura. There are the lens of the two different separate subsystems. However, you would like to think that as a married couple, you would absolutely co-parent. But how often have we seen in practice or even in reading how couples, you're either doing that relationship, so that subsystem extremely well, and your parenting skills may need to be fine-tuned, or heck, why does parenting classes even exist? Or then vice versa, you have a parent that is so immersed into their parental role in the parental subsystem that the couple relationship is now lacking. So being able to navigate the two. So I think they are ideally a one class of a system, and separating them is actually ideal, because the reality is how many cleavers, leave it to beaver cleaver, examples do we have even today? So it just simply, it's outdated and antiquated if for me, if I were to think, because oftentimes when I see it in practice, I'm having, couples that are coming in, their relationship is wonderful, but then if I see the family system as a whole, and the child is saying, hey, I'm over here starving, while they have this great, wonderful relationship, I'm not getting my needs met. So.
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. Caitlin.
It all just feels very heteronormative, this conversation. Like, it just feels very nuclear, and we just expect that there's a couple and then they get married and then they plan to have a baby when, like, I don't know any of my clients that are actually married. They've been together quickly, they have a child quickly. And so, like, absolutely there's a need to separate those roles, as sometimes families are still trying to figure out what the couple relationship even looks like before they even look at their parent relationship.
Yep.
Also, I mean, like, also looking at same-sex couples, or, you know, different kinds of couples, and how they might navigate their existence as a couple and still trying to figure that out. And then even how they become a parent. Maybe they become a parent through adoption, surrogacy, all those different kinds of things, and how that can change the dynamic. So I just feel like George, I would push you a little bit on that, because I just feel like there's other ways to think about it, and why they really are super separate and need to be discussed separately, especially too, also like sibling position. I know that's Bowen, right? But like their first child, like how a couple's navigating with their first child from a couple, because there's always that tension, right? When they have a baby, and then like everything changes. No one knows how to be it's like there's no book on how to be a parent. So it's like everything's kind of falling apart. So that need to kind of do both are really important. And then also the second, sorry, my phone's ringing, but yeah, that's my little rant.
I agree with you that you can be part of a parent system and not part of a couple system. And you're right, that is a very 1960s heteronormative nuclear family view in the presentation here. So good.
Justine.
I also think one problem I had with structural, to go off what Kaylin was saying, is not only was it heteronormative, but even the way they addressed the article for saying like empowerment of Black women, it was very shallow, like almost not even first order change, but like discussing their socioeconomic positioning without really exploring the underlying issues of why they're there. And like, I just see that structural could be used on such a more mass system, while I feel like the text was a very shallow, almost example, because like, given the examples Caitlin gave, like people who are not married or not heterosexual couples, there's just so much that can be explored. And within each, I guess, population, you could explore why the structure is the way it is before even addressing subsystems, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's one of the limitations, in that there's not necessarily space for larger. So it's the idea is this family is informed by these larger systems, or some of the, you know, historical reasons as to how families function, different families function differently now. But there's not a whole lot of space for exploring that in the room. So that, like, I feel like what we always end up getting to in these conversations is integration. That's where, and I don't want to like put a little, you know, bow on this or try to put a Band-Aid on this, because I think the point that you're making, Justine, is incredibly important. And that's where each theory in and of itself is limited. So that's where new theories and adaptations of theories, that's where it's birthed out of. And that's where these critiques are so important to bring up and to highlight exactly what you're talking about right here.
Yeah, I don't even think it's like only about the family though, because technically if we were to use structural family therapy, we could apply it to society. Like, just given the example of like, say a subsystem of non-heterosexual couple, and like how the larger systems of, say, policies and institutions have affected their way of being. So it's not even necessarily the theory, but Mnuchin himself, because if you read like his history of, the reason he focuses so much on parental units is because of his experience of with his own family of not experiencing that. But it's like, it's not even just integration, but application. Like, I feel like these theories could be applied to a much larger scale and it just isn't discussed.
Yeah, thank you for that. Did I have another hand? All right, let's get back into this. Does anyone want to comment on what Justine just shared? I don't want to cut off the conversation at all. All right. Okay, so the concept of boundaries. Okay, let me see if there's anything that hasn't been said. So I'll highlight this last piece right here. The therapist, we function essentially in many ways as a boundary maker. So if we're seeing, so again, if we have these very rigid boundaries, our goal is to open them up to allow influence from not only one subsystem to another, but perhaps if there's a really rigid boundary around the family, opening that up to allow some extra familial influence into that family. Then if we're seeing that these boundaries are very diffuse, they're letting in a lot of input from other places, you know, and usually we see this within subsystems, that our work is to close that boundary a little bit and more clearly differentiate the subsystems. So like here, clarifying diffuse boundaries and opening inappropriately rigid boundaries. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight some of the symbols from structural family therapy. So when you're making, when you're doing some family mapping, essentially what you would do is put these boundaries not only around the subsystem, so like the individuals within the subsystem, but also between subsystems. So an affiliation is two people like working together on something, and a coalition is generally transgenerational, and it is two people teaming up to work against another person. So that's the difference between affiliation and coalition. And in detouring, so let's say we'll go two-parent child here, where if we have the two parents here and the child here, how you would denote this is you would take an arrow from outside the parents and place it focusing on the child. That's how you would denote detouring. And so a lot of like what we've been talking about, enmeshment and disengagement are terms, or these are boundaries that basically exist in all families. So the goal isn't necessarily to make all boundaries completely clear, like that isn't necessarily kind of the end goal, but it's to better understand any sort of enmeshment or disengagement that might be happening, but it's not about eliminating them, because I would argue, and Minuchin would argue, that that's kind of impossible, that disengaged boundaries and enmeshed boundaries just exist within families. And that doesn't mean that they're inherently dysfunctional. But they just exist. So Laura, to your point, or to what you were speaking about within your own family, of sometimes I think that this is very like culturally informed, of we have a certain idea of what a clear boundary is, and anything that doesn't match that, we tend to pathologize. So I don't want, when you're taking an assessment of a family, and if you see like a disengaged boundary or an enmeshed boundary, not right away to go, oh, that needs to absolutely change. This is completely dysfunctional and something that needs to go away, to give yourself a little bit more time to understand the functioning of that boundary.
Can I say something about that for a
Yeah,
second?
absolutely.
It is very different when I think the comment, and I was reflecting after I walked away, that we tend to be harder on ourselves.
Yeah.
Because whenever I see a family, and at one point when I started with mainly Hispanic families in their own language, and I could see the productivity of being that close. So when
Mm.
I was looking at them, I was looking at this is not there is a purpose for all these behaviors, and they work within the system. But then when I was talking about myself, I wasn't giving myself the same leadway.
Mm.
But yeah, absolutely. I've been in practice for 10 years, and I can tell you that I see that a lot of this closeness, it really works together. It works
Yes.
for a reason, for financial reasons, for practical reasons. So if somebody from outside comes and says, oh, well, that's enmeshment. No, wait a minute, there is a productivity to having grandma take care of all the grand. So whatever it is. So yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking that sometimes, yeah, that I need to give myself a break on that one. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Laura. Great insight there. Okay, so it's 4 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take another 10-minute break. We'll come together at about 4:10, and then we'll finish up this PowerPoint. All right. I really appreciate the conversation that's happening. So please, let's keep doing this again. I don't necessarily want to talk as little as possible, but I don't want to talk all the time. Okay, let's get back to it. All right. So following up on some of the conversation that we've been having. So again, structural family therapy really does differentiate between that. I wanted to kind of expand, with some of the feedback that you all have been giving when I was reading and creating this. There is this, very traditional type view on the family of like, there's the assumption that these individuals are married. There's the assumption that, children just naturally kind of follow a marriage and things like that. So anyway, I'm talking about the like romantic subsystem. So really again, looking at this from a structural lens, the goal here, or what we're trying to teach the couple, is the task of complementarity and mutual accommodation. So the willingness to be influenced by your partner, the willingness to take in some feedback from your partner. And one of the concepts that is seen, or something that can be seen as problematic through the lens of a structural family therapist, is like, if this mutual interdependence is a goal, right? And the symmetrical, like complementary, more egalitarian approach is the goal, this can be hindered by either of the partners' insistence on their independent rights. So it's like, you're not allowed to necessarily be too independent because you need to be willing to take in that influence. So again, I just made the little note here of cultural consideration, where we may look at, a really emphatic willingness to be influenced as your partner as, that's enmeshment, or this really strong stance in independence as, that's too rigid. So really taking the time to understand the landscape of the particular family that you're working with. I'm getting some feedback from somebody. Okay, sorry. So being willing to really lean into investigating the functionality of these boundaries and the dynamics within these subsystems. So another thing to just keep in mind here, so structural family therapists are very active, right? So if you're going to enter into a subsystem and challenge a dynamic, hopefully it kind of goes without saying that you want to challenge the process without attacking anybody's motivations. You just want power in this relationship, and you just really want your partner to be subservient or something like that. I'm sure no one would actually say it like that, but sometimes the messaging, it doesn't really matter how we say it. The messaging is there. So I want you to, with the structural family therapist, you want to focus more on just the process and highlighting the dynamic. That's where sequencing comes in, rather than kind of looking at somebody's motivation or potential intentions and trying to change that.
I have a question.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So I know we've been talking a lot. Oh, can you hear me?
I can. Yep.
Oh, okay. I know we've been talking a lot about kind of how Minuchin executes structural, but you also said that you had there was a man, I guess, who did it from a more soulful place. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that more, because like through the text we read, I almost feel like you have to have this very assertive personality to be able to do structural, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I don't have that personality, but I'm wondering how it would look like on someone who was more, I guess, softer than Minuchin.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and if you are interested to, I'm happy to post some videos. So his name's Harry Aponte, and he conducts structural differently, whereas he'll incorporate some like further discussion of history. He really does lean into affect. So another thing with structural is you don't necessarily talk a whole lot about the emotional dynamics that happen. It's more about behavioral dynamics, whereas that's a way. And I want to speak a little bit to the like assertiveness. What was it, Justine, that you said? You said something where you need to be more assertive versus soft.
Yeah, rather than softer, almost like when I think of doing, okay, actually every time I've tried to do a paradoxical intervention, I don't know how to execute them.
Yeah. Sure. So
it's a stylistic self of therapist almost.
Yeah. So I think I want to challenge your concept of assertive and soft being mutually exclusive. Because maybe what you're talking a little bit more about is like directive or something like that. But anyway, I think that you can be assertive and soft. I think you can be assertive while coming from because when I think of soft, I think of just maybe a little bit slower, like your entrance into the confrontation or the challenge may be a little bit slower. And that really does have to do with the individual and your style. So anyway, I'm happy to provide some video with that. He speaks, so like I said, he speaks a lot more to the emotional dynamics that are happening within the family. He self-discloses quite a bit as well, in an attempt to connect to his clients. So those are some of the differences where Mnuchin just doesn't do that so much. Ploy, I see you raising your hand.
Hi, may I add?
Yeah, of course.
In order to complete for my graduation, I had to watch a lot of Aponte videos.
Great.
So I was just gonna share with Justine that if you, I can also like send it to you, how to access like the psychology .net for like all these videos. But Aponte, as Dr. Lapin was talking about, I don't know how to concisely explain it, but he did it in a way that, in contrast to Mnuchin, where he would use like paradoxical, almost being sarcastic or almost like going like really far-fetched from what he's where he's trying to get at. I feel like upon the way Aponte would do it, he would be very brutally honest, but from a very humble stance, as if this is what he's seeing. Like, what do you see in this? And then sometimes the wording itself combined with his affect, if we're only reading at his script, you could totally see that it's 100% a paradoxical question, but the way he delivers it, it's almost like an invitation to entertain whether this is the dynamic that has happened within the family dynamic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think his approach was a little bit more it's a little bit more tentative. So whereas Mnuchin would say something like, "This is happening," Aponte would say, "I think this might be something that's occurring." And again, that's not necessarily more or less assertive. It's just a delivery. But also recognizing that we have a lot of power in this dynamic, right? In this, where if you conclusively state a fact, you may manufacture that as opposed to coming in a little bit more tentatively. Thank you so much for that, Ploy. And yes, like what Jackie had shared, Aponte also was one of, I think, like the formulator, if not one of the formulators of Self of the Therapist. So just really understanding yourself as a tool in the room and all of the influences. We all know what Self of the Therapist is, but he was really integral in creating that as a training program. So taking the concept of Self of the Therapist and creating it into something that was incorporated into curriculum. So naturally that influences the way that he does therapy.
Thank you to both of you. Like, that helped really.
Good. Oh, let me I keep going to show you guys my PowerPoint and then not sharing the screen. Okay. We're almost there, guys. Okay. So yeah, keep the questions and comments coming. So hopefully, so I'm going to move into the parental subsystem and hopefully give you, you know, some clarity of how you conceptualize these two subsystems differently, because it's the recognition that, so this is one of the foundational pieces of structural family therapy, is that the couple subsystem is the foundation of the family. So keeping that couple subsystem strong and attending to that, because one of the things that can happen with parents is that their identity is exclusively their role as a parent. So exactly what you were talking about, Laura, when, you know, parents are empty nesters, then they look at this partner that they haven't talked to, you know, really without like, attending to children for 18, 20 years. And then they say, I don't know who you are anymore. So it's the idea that you're holding these two roles simultaneously, and they both function differently, and they should be attended to differently. So, you know, kind of the quintessential, you know, one of the interventions that we use, or pieces of homework that we use quite a bit with couples, is a date night, you know, this dedicated time to reconnecting with your identity as a romantic partner, and looking at this person that you created a family with, or expanded, I'll say. You don't create a family. Families aren't created with children, they are expanded with children. So this person that you are raising human or humans with, and seeing them as your romantic partner, aside from your co-parent. So that's really sorry, I'm just looking at some comments, I'm getting distracted. But that's really where our job is, to help the couple attend to their roles in both. Where, so like something you would look out for is some language. And again, this could be very culturally appropriate, but it also could be an indicator of something that is something that could be worked on. Is if, you know, let's say you're talking to this couple and they address each other as mom and mom, or mom and dad, or dad and dad, that would indicate to you that they may not be seeing that person as a romantic partner, that they may be only conceptualizing this person as a person to raise their children with. So these are just things to kind of keep an eye out for. So this is where in the parental subsystem, so the couple subsystem in an intact family must differentiate to perform tasks of socializing children. So they're moving from this potentially, and again, the points that all of you bring up is like, sometimes the couple subsystem and the parental subsystem start at the exact same time. So there's this learning of how do we, like, what do we look like in these roles? How do we function with one another in these roles? But there's also the possibility of an adaptation happening, where you start as a couple subsystem and your attention really is on, you know, growing connection to one another, learning about one another, and then you're adding another human being into this kind of formula. And then it's, you know, now how do we navigate the new roles? So again, you're hearing some of the language of a couple of a structural family therapist, of adaptation, of adjustment, of family life cycle. One thing that I do want to point out here, because I think it's something that, you know, parents can come in and be incredibly distressed about, is the idea that children cannot grow and become individuated without rejecting and attacking boundaries or rules. It is, the process of socialization is inherently conflictual. So parents come in and say, they won't listen to me, they're so rebellious, you know, they question everything I say. And that's part of our job to normalize that. Of course, you know, there's extremes of that where that needs to be attended to. A lot of it is very developmentally normative. So as I mentioned earlier, the boundaries between the parental subsystem and the sibling subsystem, or the child subsystem, it's this, it's the first place that children learn about boundaries and about social interactions. So they also, it's a place for them to also learn about imbalances of power, and that's an inherent piece of society. Just wanting to make sure that I'm okay. You guys are just sharing some resources. Great. And sometimes what parents will do is when they're feeling like they are out of control, they'll use excessive control to where, you know, the complete restriction, really strong parameters. And what our job in terms of our like psychoeducation is to allow some of that conflict to happen naturally, so that the parents don't have such a stronghold on the children that their essentially attempt to control becomes ineffective, because children will just move kind of outside of the system and not allow any influence by their parents, because their parents are so like kind of discipline and punishment oriented. Okay, just wanting to make sure that I'm keeping up on all the comments. Okay, so here's the child subsystem, sibling subsystem. So our job as the therapist is to understand the developmental needs. So just recognizing that staged approaches, or, you know, stage theories like Erikson, that recognizing that that's not set in stone, that there's, you know, derivations, I guess, from that. But to understand that, you know, a 6-year-old is contending with this generally, a 15-year-old is contending with this generally. So again, there is some psychoeducation that needs to happen with the parental subsystem, or that executive subsystem. But also as we're interacting with the children, knowing that we're attending to any sort of developmental needs or developmentally normative like struggles that the child is going through, because that will help them build autonomy, yeah, and be able to you know, decrease potentially some of the conflict when there's understanding of where people are at developmentally in the family. Okay. So adaptation, you know, something that we are facilitating with the family. So transitional processes of adaptation to new situations that carry a lack of differentiation, and the anxiety that characterize all new processes may be mislabeled as pathological. So like I was saying earlier, we get this snapshot of the family. And if we don't take enough time to understand some of the context, some of the, yeah, I'll just say context, that we might be looking at something through a lens of pathology that's pretty normative, or the family could be conceptualizing it as that way of, you know, we've never had this struggle before. Why are we going through this struggle? But if the family is not, so within the structural lens, if the family is not differentiated, if they are functioning out of high anxiety, then the adaptation process may be hindered. So there's, what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of factors to take into consideration here, that you want to give yourself the chance to see the broader picture of the family beyond this like moment that you're working with them. And that's where some of this historical information can be helpful to touch on, of like what we talked about before with Emily, and how, you know, Emily and Mark, prior to moving in with parents, and then post moving in with parents, you know, how did you deal with this stuff? Okay. So stress can come from many sources, and these are all important to understand in your assessment of families. So stress can come from one member and their interactions with extrafamilial forces. So this could be like one person and their peers, one person and their workplace environment, recognizing that these outside forces absolutely influence the family. So this could also be the whole family with extrafamilial forces. So some of the things that were mentioned in the text were experiencing things like poverty and discrimination. So this is an experience that the entire family is having, and that inevitably affects the family. So sometimes what you can do is act as the family's like resource center for if there is. So again, this is the importance of what we do with case management and linking to resources, and potentially there's stuff that is outside the confines of the therapeutic experience, but there's resources that are existing that the family needs to be connected to. Any sort of stress at a transitional point. So again, perpetual adjustment, new subsystems with an adoption, a birth, anything like that. And then with that, any addition of a new member, new boundaries need to be created, and these lines of differentiation need to happen. And again, very much it's our job to normalize this, that in this process of these transitional points in the family, that conflict is inevitable. Change doesn't really come without some kind of conflict or some kind of adjustment period. And then there's stress around some idiosyncratic problems. So these three facets that were mentioned in the text, a family is transformed over time, adapting and restructuring itself to continue functioning. So again, it's the whole point of all of this is continuity of the family, maintaining the roles, rules, boundaries, organization of the family. So adaptation needs to happen in order to do that. The family has a structure that can only be seen in movement. So this is where as the therapist, you can come in and poke around a little bit. One of the things that you can do to figure out boundaries is to, so when we're working with these hypotheses, right, of like, we think that this is a dynamic that exists, we think that this is a rule that exists within the family, a really good way to test that is to violate it. So an example of this could be, let's say you're talking to the child subsystem, and every time you address a question to the child subsystem, a member of the parental subsystem steps in and answers for the children or the child. That is where you can literally block that person to say, I appreciate you jumping in here. I'm actually talking to your child here. I'm interested in hearing from the child. So just kind of seeing how the system responds to that essentially rule violation or that dynamic violation that you just created. So that's what we mean by movement, of interrupting some of the transactional patterns that again inevitably inform the rules, roles, subsystem hierarchy patterns. So the family also adapts to stress in a way that maintains family continuity while making restructuring possible. So this is essentially what our goal is to recognize that stress is inevitable. And we want to help give tools to our clients that allow for them to maintain some level of identity within the family, while also being able to restructure if needed. But the restructuring piece is the part that's the most difficult. Okay, so wanting to go over some concepts for you. Like I said earlier, the concept of joining is not necessarily super different, but it's very specific. Structural family therapists have a very specific conceptualization of joining. So there's the process of, I think I'm saying it right, mimesis, which is essentially like mimicking some of the language, the dynamics, the emotional state. So you're joining by really becoming one of the family members in terms of sometimes mannerisms and stuff like this, but you also really, one of the pieces that you really have to balance with this is not becoming disingenuous. So you're not completely changing your vocabulary to be able to match the clients, or you're not totally changing the way that you speak to match the clients. That is you don't want to be disingenuous, but like, for example, if they use a term for something that's different from yours, and I'm like blanking for an example here. This is potentially really silly, but the example that comes to mind immediately. So when I moved to Alabama, they call shopping carts buggies. And anyway, I went to the grocery store and they were like, would you like a buggy? And I was like, I don't have a child, because my understanding of a buggy was like a stroller. Anyway, so if you would want to, if let's say a family's talking about a shopping cart and they call it a buggy, go ahead and call it a buggy. Like just these little things. If a family is really demonstrative in the way that they speak, and you may not use your hands as much when you speak, that's a way of joining to be a little bit more demonstrative, but not to the point of potential mockery. So it's like you want to maintain some of your identity in that, but match the clients in a way. And that's where that accommodation piece comes in. So if you, again, maintaining being genuine with this and mirroring some of the client's nonverbal communication, you're adjusting to the system's interactional patterns. So you you don't want to come like barreling in saying, I see A, B, C, D, that's not working for you here. The idea of joining is coming into the system and, like we always say, meeting the clients where they are, because you have to build that trust and respect and that therapeutic alliance with the family before you can make any sort of adjustments. So that's the concept behind, or that's the definition behind joining. So then we have structural mapping. So this is where you literally make a map of the family's structure. So you have you would draw each of the subsystems, the boundaries around the subsystems. And if you wanted to, you could outline the rules and roles of each member of each subsystem and then each member of the family. So I know that we're likely pretty familiar with genograms. This is another way of understanding the functionality of a family. So in order to create your map, you're observing the interactions, and then you're assessing this and taking note of the transactional patterns that happen, how flexible the family is, how willing they are to be influenced by one another, who talks when, who talks first. So you're understanding all of the dynamics through observation and then creating a map for that. Marcy, I see you raised your hand. Oh, and somebody else did too.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sarah too. Oh, no, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay, so is it my understanding that a family map is very much in a present moment space, whereas a genogram would be much more multi-generational?
Yeah, so a genogram is still present in terms of you're working with the couple or the people, the family right now making it. But it includes all of the historical elements. But yes, you're right. A family map is this snapshot of how the family is structured, organized right now. What are the rules, roles right now? Who exists within subsystems right now? Who is out of subsystems right now? What do the boundaries look like? How do they function? So yes, the genogram allows, so it's generally 3 generations, right? So you've got grandparents, parents, and then the clients. And then the structural map is just who is in the family right now. Sarah, you had a question too?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to do this theory worksheet as you're talking. So my question is, these things like joining and mapping, would they be considered therapist function roles, or would these be major concepts, or?
A family mapping is like an intervention. It's an assessment and an intervention, much like a genogram. A genogram is both an assessment and an intervention, because it can help you see what was previously maybe implicit. And then joining is like part of the process. So I don't really know. I guess that would be kind of a therapist function.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Sure. Okay. Let's keep rocking. Okay. So then there's the concept of enactment. So I really want to differentiate for you an enactment and a role play. So as we know with role plays, what we want to do is have the clients like act out a different way to interact. Right. So if they say, oh my gosh, I had this fight, you know, we just had this really bad fight and I just would like to have communicated more clearly, or I was yelling a lot and I just want to communicate more calmly. A role play is an invitation to kind of like redo what happened in a different way, more like constructive way. An enactment is very similar to, and I would say it's like an offshoot of sequencing. So sequencing is understanding what happened, then what happened next, and what happened next, and what happened next. An enactment is a very experiential way of doing sequencing. But enactment can be either verbal, where it's like, all right, family, you just outlined this situation that happened. Okay, so it sounds like it started with Susie, you did this. Okay, and then what happened? So you're going through kind of this verbal enactment of what happened, but there's also, so that's kind of like the, I guess for lack of a better term, kind of like less active way or less experiential way to do this. But then an enactment also allows for the clients to literally act out what happened. So feel free to move about the room, talk to each other exactly the way that you talk to each other, look and do, and have your nonverbals the way that you did in this. So you're focusing as or your function in this is a director. So, and then what happened? Okay, so Susie, then you stormed out of the room. Okay, go ahead and storm to the corner there. What did you do when you stormed out of the room? So it's a very active, like kinesthetic type of experience for the clients. All right, so then there's the concept of unbalancing. So unbalancing is really about altering the hierarchy of a system. So this can be like particularly relevant with like a parentified child. So again, I say that knowing that that is something that is not always pathological. So the idea of allowing for, okay, let me back up. So we have inherent power in the room. So any subsystem that we choose to join, that can literally be us like separating the room in terms of subsystems. So we have like parent here, child here, grandparent here. And so we're separating the subsystem so they can see each other's existence and how they are differentiated from one another. So let's say that I'll run with the example that I'm using right now. We've got a 3-generation household, 1 grandparent, 1 parent, 1 child. And the child, let's say, maybe is being parented by both the parent as well as the grandparent. So from a structural standpoint, the person that would be the primary parent of the child is the child's parent, and the grandparent would take a more supportive role of the parent. So the unbalancing might be, let's say that the grandparent has the majority of the influence on the child, and the parent really wants to assert more influence on the child and have more of a say in how the household is run. And this is not necessarily taking into consideration whose house we're in or anything like this. We're focusing specifically on parenting, where the therapist may join with the parent in an effort to create power in that subsystem. Because we hold inherent power in the room, whatever subsystem we join becomes inherently more powerful because we're elevating that perspective. We're giving a platform to their experience. So it's really about trying to highlight some of the ways in which a hierarchy may be out of order. So that's the idea of unbalancing, is bringing the idea of the hierarchy, making it very explicit, and then changing some of those transactional patterns that obviously will have to carry out into outside of the room, but allowing for a person or subsystem that should be either in power or shouldn't be in power, and restructuring that way through transactions. Justine, were you talking?
No, I was waiting for you to finish.
I'm finished.
No, I think this is where I had a problem with the theory too, because I think in terms of unbalancing a system, depending kind of what we've been going off of, like depending on the context, because there was one example in the book where it was almost like the mother had an alliance with the child, as of the father not understanding him. But say like just severe cases, or for example, say the child was molested by a family member and the mom is siding with him.
Sure.
And yes, if the parental subsystem could align in the mother influencing the father, great. But I also don't think if it goes the other way around, it would be great, if that makes sense.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Like, okay, if we're talking about, because within this theory, as Mnuchin describes it, the parental subsystem is almost not the most important, but their relationship has to be a foundation for the system. And say there was a child who was sexually abused by a family member who already had a coalition with the mother in having a mutual understanding, I would only see the system, or the homeostasis being broken in a more positive way for the family if the dad was able to come to understand the child. However, if that was in reverse, for example, if a therapist would require the parental subsystem to be first, except the mom, because of the father, the mom would deny what has happened, even though she previously understood it, I would kind of see that as problematic.
Ooh, I'm sorry, Justine, I don't know if I'm following you. So the situation is abuse that's happened to the child.
Yes.
From an extended family member?
Yeah, like an uncle or an aunt.
Sure. And so, and is that in this scenario, the mom's sibling, or does it matter?
It doesn't matter.
Okay, so then there's this coalition with the mom and the child.
I'll try to simplify, or Caitlin, go, I think she may.
I feel like I know where you're getting at, but I just feel like that example, it might not be good for the intervention of unbalancing. Yeah. So I think that scenario could happen, but I don't think unbalancing that connection, that relationship between the mom and the child would necessarily need to happen, because it still underpins the part that maybe the dad does feel left out or alone or not connected to his wife or whatever it is. But I don't think in that situation, like a therapist would use an unbalancing technique.
Yeah.
For that specific scenario because of the sexual abuse. But there probably are other times where it would be necessary.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it probably wasn't the best example. I think it's more so around a context. And I can't think of anything right now of what if in some cases, for example, the alignment with a child and mother is actually important, rather than having the parental subsystem be strengthened first, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And to your point, I think that would have to be part of the assessment so that would be considered a coalition potentially, because it's intergenerational, but maybe in functionality it's not, because it's not necessarily like meant to push out the dad or the other parent. So affiliations can be really helpful. Alliances, I guess, would be another way to do that. So when you're looking at coalitions, that's where there's potentially something to intervene. So a coalition is two people coming together to push out another person or to work against another person. And within the framework of a family, that's probably not the best dynamic to have existing. An alliance or an affiliation on the other hand, could be something incredibly adaptive and really positive to have within a family. So you'd have to look at the functionality of the relationship. So, but if, for example, if the like unbalancing would be appropriate if like, let's say that there's a, you know, an 8-year-old in a system that calls the shots. That like we go on vacation when this child wants to go on vacation. We, you know, make family decisions based on the mood and behavior of this child. That's where unbalancing would have to happen, where this parental or parent subsystem would need to regrab, I don't know what the verb I'm looking for right here, the control and power and influence in the family, because that child is inappropriately given too much power. So unbalancing is usually between subsystems and with a parentified child, or when like that romantic or executive subsystem is really unbalanced to the point where it's creating resentment, or it's not allowing for any sort of influence from one of the parents.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking like when you said that, it makes a lot of sense. And thank you for clarifying, because I almost thought alliance and coalition, like there was a fine line, but now I understand. Just in terms of what we've been talking about, and using the example of like, for example, the Wagner family, and say this couple was in therapy while they were living at her mom's. So in the assessment, say the mom had all the power and was trying to, I don't want to use the word align or coalitioned with the daughter to try to like, let's say, manipulate the husband.
Sure.
Would that then have to be addressed, or depending on the context of like, say it is her house. So would that be taken into consideration, or is it still just a almost generational thing?
So,
or like parent.
Yeah, of course, all of those contextual factors are always relevant. So in this, it may not be like an unbalancing intervention. It may be a strengthening of a boundary around the romantic subsystem, where, so if the influence of the mom is negatively affecting that couple or romantic subsystem, that would be an issue of boundaries rather than like having which would not inadvertently, directly give the mom less influence over the romantic relationship. She won't like it. People who benefit from a lack of boundaries never like boundaries. So and anytime a boundary is created, there will be pushback. But remember, the purpose of boundaries is to maintain a relationship. It's not to push people out. It's to be able to sustain that relationship, because as it's functioning at this moment, it's not sustainable. So they're relationship continuers, not relationship enders. So does that make sense? Is that like, that wouldn't be probably the intervention that's used in that scenario?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense now, because I think in my mind, I think what was difficult for me to compute was almost because within both those interventions, it's a shift of power, but depending on what intervention you do, one almost takes power away while the other uses a boundary. So no power gets taken away.
Right.
Yes.
Influence is changed. Yes.
Yes.
Great. Good example. Any other questions about unbalancing or its application? All right, just a couple more minutes here. I'm hopping around the PowerPoint a little bit. So let me move here because we only have a couple of minutes left. So again, getting to many of the beautiful critiques that you have all highlighted. So this is specific to, because again, what we have learned about structural in its kind of foundations is a specific view of a family, and we recognize that families are all different. So one of the things that you can do to be more attuned to the family is one of the things that we've talked about with like a single parent. You could use the like father subsystem or speak to the specific person rather than their role. So that would just be kind of a way to like individualize what you are doing. So changing the language can begin to address any sort of gender dynamics and pressures that can also be present. So if you treat gender as a structural variable as opposed to an individual characteristic. So again, if you're looking at, so obviously feminist critiques very heavily on inclusion of gender, then of course we have some other intersections of identity that are included in this. Understanding that person's social position in that is important as well, which is the point of the second part. And I think, Justine, something that you were speaking to of hierarchies that exist beyond the family system. So understanding that this individual in this family is influenced by larger factors. So things like gender, race, political standing, class, these are all things that in its original form, in its unadapted, like uncritiqued form, didn't take necessarily into consideration and explicitly address how these overarching societal hierarchies absolutely influence the family that's sitting in front of you. And if we don't discuss these overtly, so this is that concept of broaching, right? Where you are bringing these social hierarchies and these social influences into the room, where you're not viewing the family as a vacuum and asking questions about societal pressures and experiences of discrimination or experiences or like oppressive practices, institutionalized influences on the family and how that influences its functioning. So just some things to keep in mind, that you absolutely can pull these factors and should pull these factors into the room when you're talking with the family to better understand them and their context, because the patterns within the family can make a whole lot of sense if you understand the influences that are larger than them, that are outside of the family. So just some other things to consider. One of the things that we actually have talked about today is so structural family therapists really want, if you are in the household, like you should come into therapy. And sometimes that is, and some of the boundaries that you want to create in, again, so for example, like a 3-generation household, and some of the boundaries that you may want to, or the, rebalancing of power may not be appropriate. So you're essentially imposing a process onto a family that you'll lose their trust, or what you're doing is not relevant, and it could potentially be more harmful to the family than beneficial. So one of the things about the kind of quintessential, parentified child is so here the idea is that the dysfunction occurs when a parent doesn't embrace their role of authority. So when they're placing unreasonable responsibility onto a child, so that also is very specific to families. The idea of a parentified child, so if there's a child that has influence, if there's a child that has a responsibility and a role in the family, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing. It's, again, from a structural standpoint, if that parent is unwilling or unable to step into more of an authority position, that's where some dysfunction can happen, because ultimately what is from a structural approach or a structural viewpoint is that when children are given too much responsibility or too much power, that doesn't really allow for them to be kids. And that's, even though they may like it in the short term of like, oh, I get to decide like what's for dinner or, you know, whatever it is, that long term, that's too much to ask of a child in terms of making a decision, because they're really not developmentally able to do that. So that's my finishing. Any comments, questions as we wrap up class?
There is one thing, but I don't want to keep people. There was one example in the book that seemed super dysfunctional almost, when the wife, I forget who the couple was, but it was almost like the wife had a private session with the structural therapist about how she wanted to sleep with other men. And then he kind of brought it up. And I was just like, what? Like, first of all, wouldn't that be it's just, I think because of our practicum experience of like, I wouldn't meet with, if I'm doing a couple, then I wouldn't meet with one person alone. And if they told me that with a no secrets policy, that would just be, I don't know, I would find it hard to juggle those dynamics.
Yeah, so really briefly to speak to that, there's multiple approaches you can take to that. So, so there are some systems practitioners who refuse to see anybody but the entire system. And that's in prevention of that situation, of the potential of a secret that's happening or that's disclosed. But you can also, there are many couples counselors or family counselors that meet with individual people just to allow them kind of this like unfiltered space. You know, maybe they're noticing that people aren't disclosing when they're around family members and they want to give them the opportunity to talk as freely as they want. And then but you can still have like a no secrets kind of policy, but it would be more about how the disclosure happens. So you could have something like in your informed consent where it says, if you share something with me that would change the trajectory of our therapy or like a goal of therapy, I'm going to disclose it immediately, or this has to be disclosed. So I'm just thinking of like, if you have a couple that's in counseling where one person, where the thought is we're working on our relationship and the goal is to continue together. And then some person discloses an ongoing affair that they're currently in, that they have no desire to end. And quite frankly, they're just looking for a time to like end the relationship with that person. Yeah, if you guys have places to go ahead. Thank you guys. So then you have the opportunity to say, this is going to change the trajectory. Now we have to come up with a plan of how to disclose this. So I just say all that, Justine, to say that it's not frowned upon necessarily to meet with people individually, and that opens up a lot of opportunity to disclose. But then you have to be very transparent, I think, in your informed consent about how you will handle disclosures like that, because not all disclosures or not all things shared in an individual session even need to be shared with the whole system. Because it might be something that's like, you know, I've had doubts about our relationship. Like that isn't necessarily something that would be considered a secret. So I don't know if I just kind of went on a tangent or anything, but.
No, I thank you so much for that. I think what I was more concerned with is because she disclosed like, I want to have sex